Welcome back to Morrilton University. Today we'll be delving a bit deeper into a topic that was touched on briefly in our Blaberta video, dysfunctional family roles. We will be discussing 3 different dysfunctional family units, showcased in Beforel Orel, starting with Clay and Blaberta's childhood homes, before moving into the current Puppington household. We will be breaking down the unhealthy dynamics in each household to explain how they play a major role in the development of a child's adapted self, as well as look into how that influences them into adulthood and the effects on subsequent generations.
What is a dysfunctional family? A dysfunctional family is identified as any sort of family where there is a pattern of conflict, misbehavior, or abuse. There are many different dynamics that can contribute to dysfunction taking place, but there are a few universal features and behaviors that may occur, such as denial, inadequate or missing boundaries, extremes in conflict, or unequal or unfair treatment of one or more family members due to varying factors, such as birth order or gender. Children who grow up in dysfunctional homes often don't know their situation is abnormal, and the dysfunction plays a huge part in how the child forms their identity. This evaluation was first discussed by Virginia Satir, who noticed patterns regarding certain personas or roles that children would develop within alcoholic or addicted families. This was often used as compensation or a coping mechanism to distract them from their parents' dysfunction. Over time, this broadened to include diagnosis of children who did not exclusively come from alcoholic families, and today, many variations of family roles exist. For the sake of consistency, however, we will be referring to the system as dysfunctional family roles, which has a broader scope.
So what do these roles entail? How many are there? And how the heck do they relate to Beforel Orel? Role 1. The golden child. The child who's often favored and receives special treatment and praise from their parent. They may also suffer from the weight of high expectations and a need to succeed out of fear of losing their position as the family favorite. They're expected to excel at and achieve what the parent demands of them, and may often be a proxy for achievements the parent failed to act on in their own childhood or adult lives. What distinguishes the golden child from the hero is the offending parent's level of involvement in their achievements. The parent may attempt to project themselves onto the child, diminishing their sense of self, and snapping if they ever put a toe out of line. Examples of this would be Medilla Hymentacts, as well as Lunchbox, who seems to be a golden child in the making.
Number 2, the hero. The hero feels that they need to make the family look normal on the surface. This child tends to become a compulsive overachiever, excelling through sports, academics, or any other area that may bring pride onto the family. Their unconscious mission is to make outside observers think this child must come from a good, well-adjusted family. After all, they're so successful. This is an immense burden to bear, but one that the hero adopts completely unconsciously. For example, Oral Puppington.
Number 3. The invisible child. The child who is underacknowledged and undervalued by their parents. They are often ignored or dismissed, and often feel as if they don't exist at all in the eyes of those around them. The invisible child may often be regarded by the offending parent as not suitable to fill the needs deemed important, or may not fit into the role they require of them. The invisible child often becomes used to the idea of being unseen, and this will persist in the areas outside of the home. Often this child will have difficulty developing socially. Examples of this in the series are Blaberta and Shapy Puppington.
Number 4, the mascot. The role of the mascot, or the family clown, is to relieve tension through humor and positivity. The mascot is on high alert for situations in need of diffusion, especially in the case of conflict between parents or other family members. The child attempts to sidestep conflict by making people laugh. Their upbeat nature is underscored by a pervasive sense of anxiety. They may grow up not understanding how to process their own emotions due to only knowing how to deal with it through humor. For example, little Clay, as seen in passing.
Number 5. The scapegoat. The punching bag of the family, and is used as a meaning of blame in place of legitimate issues. Could be seen as a problem child or troublemaker. They could also be the member of the family who's verbalizing or acting out against the problems the family is trying to deny or conceal. Examples of this would be young Clay in passing, who is scapegoated by Arthur, and Raymond Hymentacts, who is scapegoated by his wife, even within a parental role.
Number 6, the caretaker/enabler. The role of the enabler is to clean up the offending parent or spouse's messes. The caretaker may keep the family running smoothly by making excuses for the dysfunctional behaviors such as addiction or abuse, and if they are a child, they may become parentified in order to care for younger siblings. This enables the unhealthy behaviors of the parents who are in some way failing to meet the physical or emotional needs of their kids. Their adult relationships may become codependent. For example, Bloberta, in both her relationships with her father and Clay, as well as Orel, implied in the credit scene of Honor.
The first family we're going to cover is the Hymentacts. The dynamic of the Hymentact family is quite unique given the regressive culture of Morrilton, as we see that the family is run by the matriarch of the house, Mrs. Hymentacts. Though there are many different forms of parenting that can lead to a dysfunctional family system, in this case, our offender is possessive, critical, and controlling of her children. She seems more concerned by their usefulness and how they can serve the family. The home is run in a very rigid and demanding way. Even in the set dressing, we see just how controlling she is, as the furniture is covered in sterile plastics. No doubt in an attempt to keep an outward appearance of a pristine and perfect household with no room for flaws. It reflects her need to hold control over not only the home, but also her rigid family mold, and by extension, her own appearance. Those who do not fit into her vision of the perfect family are cast aside and ignored in the case of Bloberta, or if they don't comply with her demands, they're beaten down emotionally until they do so, in the case of Raymond. Raymond Hymentacts may be the patriarch of the household, but he is far removed from being the head of house. We could call him an enabler in this case, but this is purely due to his lack of action. He doesn't stand by Mrs. Hymentacts' side, but he doesn't oppose her either. He makes an offhand comment here and there and bows his head later on, while attempting to soothe the situation through his alcoholism. We don't know the full extent of his relationship with Mrs. Hymentacts, but it's possible there may have been a level of physical abuse present in addition to verbal abuse. Mrs. Hymentacts' influence exerted the members of the family into particular roles, with Raymond being relegated to the scapegoat. Due to this, his own influence was diminished and allowed her to place the children into particular roles as well. Beginning with Modella, what we see in Help suggests that the role that she fits into is that of the golden child. For the Hymentacts, the golden child is an interesting role, because when we see things unfold, there seems to be a potential for both Modella and Lunchbox to fill this spot. Modella is the oldest daughter in the family, though we don't know exactly how much older she is than Bloberta. Physically, she's the spitting image of her mother, which in a subtle way shows their closeness. It's likely that this is part of the reason that Mrs. Hymentacts would have pushed her into a golden child role, living vicariously through someone she perceived as a younger version of herself, one who was free to pursue the things that she couldn't in her own childhood. Clearly, she has cultivated her talents well, as Mrs. Hymentacts sings her praises about Modella's perfect pitch in an attempt to dismiss Bloberta. Despite this, however, not even Modella is above criticism here, as before Mrs. Hymentacts was aware of Bloberta's presence, Modella was the first to receive blame in the situation, while another child avoids this.
Modella, I'm surprised at you. It wasn't I, Mother.
But we'll put a pin in that for now. But with Modella, there is a bit of hope. She doesn't actively chide or berate her sister, but she does defend herself, and we see her perk up when her mother compliments her afterwards. This could indicate that she feels tenuous in her position, as many golden children often feel immense pressure to maintain their role and remain in their parents' good graces, which could be worsened with Lunchbox in the picture. There becomes a need for her to protect the position on the pedestal her mother has placed her on, which in some ways we see may be failing as Lunchbox gets older. Though we never get to see Modella again in the series, it's possible that as an adult she could fit into the category of a guilt-ridden golden child, the kind that still holds empathy for their siblings, and tries to find a way to mend that rift that was formed between them by their parents. Now let's circle back to that scene from before. When Bloberta chimes in during choir practice, Mrs. Hymentacts considers Modella to be the one who caused the disruption. To her, Bloberta isn't even a consideration, but it couldn't possibly be her dear little Lunchbox. She considers him to be above such an error. There are a couple potential reasons for this. Lunchbox could potentially be some sort of prodigy, while Modella has to work harder to prove herself. Or, given the climate of Morrilton, it's safe to assume that it's because of his gender. Lunchbox is Mrs. Hymentacts' first son, and therefore his value is automatically higher than both of her daughters. Lunchbox seems to revel in the attention their mother gives him as well, though he is openly punished for his immaturity when he openly mocks Bloberta, so he may not be fully integrated into the golden child role yet. He is still young and immature after all. We know very little about Lunchbox, but given his behavior and position in the family, it's interesting to consider him maturing into the polar opposite version of the golden child, the kind that buys into the excessive validation and hype of the offending parent, and truly believes that their achievements make them better than everyone else. Then we have Bloberta, the odd one out in her family, an invisible child. Bloberta is not hated enough to be a scapegoat. She's instead treated as if she doesn't even exist. In her mother's eyes, she holds little value. So little, in fact, that she's barely acknowledged. Back when we see Mrs. Hymentacts scold Modella, she doesn't even consider Bloberta as an option until she makes her presence in the room known. Only then will her mother recognize her, but only so she can bring her down even further. She dismisses the idea of Blibberta being included in the choir because Medela is simply better than her at it. Her words give us a small glimpse into her thought process. To Mrs. Hymentacts, Blibberta is redundant. She has no place or use for her. She sees Blibberta as less talented, but in reality, it's far more likely that Blibberta's talents were simply not given the attention they needed to develop properly, which is common with invisible children. They're not given the notice they need to develop socially and within their interests. So Blibberta continues to relegate herself to the background, because it's the only thing that spares her any crumbs of validation from her mother. Often this is common with children in this role. It may be the only way she thinks she can receive love and acceptance in her family, but it only serves to stifle her further emotionally. Even the one person she feels any sense of validation from, her father, is tenuous in his exchange with her. Despite this, he still tries to try, a gesture that to Blibberta does not go unnoticed. It's the closest thing she receives to a genuine loving connection, and in that moment she feels valued, even if it is fleeting. This dynamic with her father, in a way, repeats itself in her married life. An invisible child into adulthood may survive on dissociative fantasies of meeting their soulmate and becoming preoccupied with finding someone to complete them, rather than developing and asserting their own unique identity, which they never had the chance to form within their family unit. In Blibberta's case, she, in many ways, subconsciously enabled her father's behavior. She saw his actions as good because of the fragile kindness he would show her and rationalized to herself that these moments were healthy and normal for her. So, as she moves into adulthood, she repeats this cycle, blending her roles as an enabler to her father, an invisible child to her mother within her marriage with Clay. But we'll get back to this.
In the case of the first-generation Puppingtons, Angela, as a mother, is codependent and emotionally incestuous. Because she is deeply traumatized by the multiple miscarriages leading up to her firstborn living son, Angela behaves as a helicopter parent, overprotective and refusing to let Clay form his own identity. He mirrors aspects of her personality down to physical gestures and seems to take responsibility for her peace of mind. This emotional enmeshment backfires on her when one of his pranks gives her a heart attack that kills her. Arthur, however, played the role of the enabler. While Arthur was bothered by his wife's over-coddling of their son, he never stepped in to rectify or intervene in his upbringing. Had Arthur been more proactive as a figure in Clay's life, he might not have shown the delayed level of emotional maturity he exhibits in passing, which had been brought about by Angela's sheltering. After Angela dies, Arthur blames Clay entirely for it and never reconciles with him.
I don't need any more of your leftovers.
Arthur does not try to explain to Clay what he does wrong, only slapping him at random when he misbehaves or goads him. In the case of Clay, he had some golden child qualities, was most definitely a mascot, and then was eventually scapegoated by his father. Clay was favored by his mother compared to his father, almost treated like a surrogate spouse. The effects of this treatment, along with her sudden death, psychologically scar him into his adulthood. Clay seems cognizant of when his parents are bickering and acts to lighten the mood with his presence, distracting his mother from their fights. After Angela's death, Clay learns that the only way to receive what he perceives to be love from his father is to goad him into striking him. Clay shoulders the blame for his mother's death and goes on to have deep-seated self-esteem issues into adulthood. Fast forward to the second-generation Puppingtons. Clay has grown up to be an addict. His dysfunction, while largely withdrawn, is defined by his addiction. He drinks to cope with the unhappiness he feels in his marriage and life. Not having been raised properly by his own father, Clay's parenting is a combination of his mother's religious scrupulosity and his father's withdrawal, as well as the corporal punishment encouraged by the community in Morrilton. Clay tries to overcompensate for his insecurity and his masculinity by projecting a dominant persona, despite being very passive in his interpersonal relationships, such as with his wife, Blibberta. Clay, never having learned to process his emotions, instead bottles them up until he explodes violently and lashes out at others.
In the Puppington marriage, we see Blibberta act as a caretaker and enabler to Clay. Blibberta's initial meeting with Clay left a large impact on him in a very detrimental way. Though she sought to help him, all she really did was start him on a path that brought him closer to that of her father's. So similarly to that relationship, she serves to be an enabler to this behavior, as well as a caretaker, despite the coldness between them. Though she may not even intend to do this, her actions, similarly to her father before her, don't do anything to change the matter at hand. We also see her continue to regulate herself to a background role, never really stepping outside of the mold she grew up in, though similarly to her childhood, she still tries to remove herself from that at times.
Orel, for the majority of the series, acts as the family hero, and at the end of it, becomes the caretaker. Orel is considered a high achiever in his community, a straight-A student, a star athlete, a very pious and God-fearing child, and he enjoys taking on challenging hobbies like stop-motion animation. This hero status easily covers up the unhappiness in his parents' marriage and makes Clay and Blaberto look good in the eyes of the community, masking their dysfunction, but not entirely. After the end of Honor, Orel resolves to act as a parental figure and a good role model to Shapey and Block, giving up his stop-motion hobby to give them a Christmas present. In doing so, he is sacrificing something dear to himself to meet the emotional needs of the younger kids in their home. In other words, he's growing up too fast.
Shapey is a bit of an elephant in the room for the Puppingtons. Because of this, he's often ignored or shunned away by both of his parents. Blaberto only usually pays him mind during moments when she's breastfeeding him, and the way that he copes with this is the direct inverse of how his mother did. He makes countless attempts to be seen in the only way he understands how, by lashing out or putting himself in harm's way. Unfortunately, this still doesn't make an impact, until a certain scene in Sacrifice that allows him to be truly seen for the first time. This, coupled with his bond with Block, paint a somewhat hopeful picture for Shapey's development, just before the unfortunate cancellation of the series. So, in conclusion, we see how these unhealthy family dynamics heavily influence those within dysfunctional families, forming a vicious cycle that ultimately harms everyone within them, which then continues on into further generations. There's potential to break these cycles, but it takes time and effort. Though we never truly learn the full extent of how this plays out in Moral Orel, we do see a brief glimpse of the conclusion, which, as fragmented as it may be, paints a hopeful picture for the future generation. Let us know what you think in the comments. In the meantime, if you want more analysis, check out our channel. Or if you still haven't watched Moral Orel yet, we have a playlist on our channel that includes the series in its entirety. We want to give a special thank you to our YouTube members, Theo Garcia, Shaw Dizzle, and Western Monk. If you're interested in becoming a channel member, you can join through the button below and gain access to a few perks, including early access to all our new videos, as well as a few extra bonuses. And if you want to submit any questions you have for our professors about Moral Orel, you can do so on our Neospring. We love to hear your feedback. That's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.
And be suspicious and cool.